So politics goes well with sports analogies, and a good analogy that I'd like to use is the telegraph throw. In football, when the opponent can see exactly where you're going to throw the ball and exactly what intent you have behind it, it's called telegraphing. And that's exactly what the liberal establishment is doing right now. And what they're telegraphing to me is that they know that this situation in Ukraine is a disaster. Now, this is an article that shows these two campaign ads from two Democratic senators that are up for reelection, Raphael Warnock and Mark Kelly. One is from Georgia, the other one is from Arizona. And both of them are basically fighting for their political lives right now, mostly because of domestic issues. The media and the White House are focused right now entirely on Ukraine. Now, there are people who are bringing up relevant questions to both Jen Psaki and the State Department, asking, what are we supposed to pay as Americans in order to sustain this war effort in Ukraine? And there's no good answer because I think that no matter how badly I think that Biden has managed the foreign policy and the crisis, he wasn't given too many good choices in the recent past. But there were certain things that he did that certainly made the situation worse. One of them was lifting sanctions several months ago against Nord Stream 2. He could have kept the sanctions on and kept the pressure on Putin, but he lifted them. Now he has to reimpose those sanctions. So he went backwards in his goal of containing Russia. And instead, now Russia has called his bluff and said, yeah, we're going to invade. We're going to do exactly what you said that we would do. And you're not going to do anything about it because you lack any of the courage and political capital in order to do anything about it. So they're telegraphing their thoughts, the liberal Democrats, by basically writing a number of articles that show they know that this is a lost cause. The cause of Ukraine is effectively a lost cause right now. And one of the people who has written one is Masha Gessen of the New Yorker, and she says the crushing loss of hope in Ukraine. Now, basically, what she goes through here, I'm not going to read the whole thing. I used to do that. I actually can't really spend too much time on these videos now because I'm trying to limit them to less than 15 minutes so that people pay attention. And she analogizes it to the feeling of many Soviet dissidents in 1968 when Czechoslovakia was invaded by the Soviet Union in order to put down a reformist government there. And this is, in my opinion, a lot of emotional nonsense. Look, most people who are observing this with objectivity, they know that you can't really justify what Putin is doing by invading most of Ukraine because it is going to yield, and it already has yielded, a lot of civilian deaths and a lot of suffering. I actually texted a friend of mine from college who's was born in Ukraine, raised here, and I said, yeah, it's hard really to know how to process what's going on overseas. I mean, I personally, I'm from a family of Israelis who moved here in the 80s. I was born here, but my parents were both Israeli citizens. I served in the Israeli army. And so I know exactly what that is about. But I don't think that in most of those conflicts, Israelis are looking at the long odds that the Ukrainians are. And the truth is that whatever you think about the legitimacy of Putin's objections to NATO expansion in Europe, which I'm going to go through try to be brief about it in a minute. You can't justify what he's doing in order to address that. Instead, what you're seeing is a lot of hyperbole where people are calling him Hitler, and they're saying that he is basically trying to rebuild the Soviet Union to get back at the West because of humiliation. And whether that's true or not, and whether he has goals beyond Ukraine, all these people are doing, people like Masha Gessen, who wrote this article, is validating him and basically empowering him. I think people like Putin, they do get a rise out of the reactions they get from people. I do remember there was this interview several years ago between him and Megyn Kelly, and you could see that he was toying with Megyn Kelly's emotions. There were other interviews I've seen with, for example, one he did with Oliver Stone, where Oliver Stone clearly could read him a little better and know how to keep a little bit more of control on the interview. And you see here that Gessen is basically trying to say that this is some sort of massive failure on the part of the West, and it's not a massive failure on the part of the West in terms of the people here. I don't think that the people of the U.S., the American people, the British people, the French people, I don't think that they ever signed on to this notion that we would have an alliance that would stretch all the way from Hawaii in the Pacific to Ukraine in Europe, that being NATO, right? So does anybody really expect that if the United States was literally attacked by a foreign country, that we would have Ukrainian and Italian and Austrian troops coming here in order to aid us? I don't think it would happen. The reality is, though, that I do think the NATO alliance actually helps to potentially put down popular uprisings within those countries, because there could be a situation, for example, where one of our NATO partners or our own government was to say, well, we can't really contain the situation at home. This is foreign subversion. We need our NATO allies to come in and support us. Somebody actually brought this up to me one time when I talked to them at I think some sort of public event, that NATO could really facilitate authoritarian domination of the civilian population. So it's the exact opposite of what people say. People have always said that NATO is in order to protect freedom from tyranny. In reality, it could be in order to protect tyranny from freedom. There was recent speculation that the U.S. could supplement the Canadian government's response to the recent trucker convoy protests if they got more out of hand than they did. You also have this article from Robert Wright. Robert Wright is a former labor secretary under President Clinton. He's a professor of economics at Berkeley, Cal Berkeley, and he is an idiot. And he's also made actually this somewhat helpful Substack article where he talks about how ineffective the sanctions game is going to be. And really what he's saying is sanctions on Russia's enormous oil and gas exports could cause substantial harm. Russia produces 10 million barrels of oil a day, which is about 10% of global demand. It ranks third in world oil production behind the United States and Saudi Arabia. It ranks second in natural gas behind the United States. So what he's really saying here, though, is that while it will hurt Russia, it will also hurt the world at large. And that's a major problem. That's why, again, it would have been better if we would have had somebody who could keep us from getting into this situation, right? Somebody that's not Joe Biden, because honestly, this is a president who said that he would prevent something like this from happening, and he helped make it happen. It's in my opinion, it's actually happening because somebody like him is in office, and we have had presidents that were able to keep Russia from doing things like this. One of them being Donald Trump. I don't think Bush was actually good at containing Putin. But that's the least of the problems with President Bush. In any case, a lot of these people are playing the blame game. All they're doing is saying, "Oh, the Republicans love Putin," whatever. Look, the people who are criticizing the Biden administration, the people who are objecting so much to what they're doing and how they're conducting the war in Ukraine, are people who have sounded the alarm for years and have said, "You have brought this on yourselves and on us because America could have avoided this." One other liberal who is telegraphing the defeat and admitting that Ukraine is basically falling to the Russians, and I think the media is sort of coping with that, is Alexander Vinman. Lieutenant Colonel Vinman, retired, who is famous for being one of the big players in the first Trump impeachment saga, as the person who was saying, "Oh, well, I leaked some of this information because I thought that the president was abusing his power by leveraging U.S. aid to Ukraine in order to get information that was politically useful." Vinman goes really far back and says, well, this is what he says. After Ukraine became independent and forfeited the world's largest nuclear arsenal, the West could have loosened the purse strings to guarantee the country's economic independence. After the 2004 Orange Revolution, the West could have embraced Ukraine's Western aspirations, accelerated an EU association agreement and a NATO membership action plan, and driven domestic transformation to shield Europe's largest country from nascent Russian revanchism. After the 2014 Revolution of Dignity, the West could have invested in a strategic security partnership with Ukraine that would have made the cost of a Russian offensive prohibitively high, yet none of this came to pass. Instead, for 2 decades, the U.S. entertained illusions about what might be accomplished with Russia, a reluctant partner, while remaining oblivious to opportunities in Ukraine, a far more willing one. In its relationship with Russia, the U.S. had limited prospects of achieving any objectives outside of arms control, whereas with Ukraine, it might have successfully influenced regional development. The seed of this conflict was planted many years ago across multiple Republican and Democratic administrations, but the Biden administration and its successors will own the geopolitical consequences of this war. So what he's trying to say is that it's not really Biden's fault that we got here. And he's partially correct, okay? But it's it's only because Biden was in the mix with other people who had more influence, people like President Bush, people like President Clinton, President Obama. I think President Trump, the policy was not perfect. What would I have done if I was in the White House as President Trump? I would have mediated the conflict and said, we have common issues to solve. Russia and Ukraine should broker an agreement on territories, or else, we're going to never get a handle on some of the real common problems. The real common problem of them is Islamic terrorism, which actually threatens Russia as well as the U.S. And it was something where they could have actually cooperated with, especially in Syria, as opposed to the U.S. basically waging a proxy war there. That's something that the media doesn't want to admit, that while Russia did wage an illegal proxy war in Ukraine, the United States also did the same thing in Syria. They did the same thing in Libya. They've done the same thing in other nations throughout the past. And that's not to endorse the character of those countries that they subverted, but it's to show that we have to acknowledge that this is a game that geopolitical powers play. And Vinman is arguing that the U.S. should have allowed Ukraine or lobbied to have Ukraine admitted into NATO as early as 2004. That is ludicrous. There is a program, okay, and this shows exactly how this began. It's called the Partnership for Peace. And what this is a partnership, as the name implies, between these countries in orange and the NATO countries. And those countries in orange were basically former Soviet states, most of them over here, at least the ones here on the right, as well as the ones in green, former Eastern Bloc countries. And after the Cold War, NATO decided to have basically bilateral cooperation with each one of these countries, and that was called the Partnership for Peace Agreement. Now, the countries in green originally were in the Partnership for Peace and then joined NATO, and the ones in orange remained in the Partnership for Peace, which really doesn't mean anything anymore because NATO is no longer really cooperating with these countries. Now, on NATO's own website, it talks about the milestones of this, and it says the Partnership for Peace admitted into it several nations, and by 1999, so all these nations started to enter in 1994. By 1999, under President Clinton, 3 partners, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland, joined NATO. So think about it. Rather than allow NATO to just develop bilateral relations with these countries and move beyond the Cold War, they started to swallow up these former Soviet puppet states, Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland, and encroach on the Russian sphere of influence. Then in 2004, you had 7 more partners: Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia joining NATO. 3 of those countries are former Soviet republics. So those are real expressions of waning Russian influence and growing NATO influence. So to have these countries that were once simply having bilateral relations with NATO, just like Russia did, suddenly move over to NATO's side and effectively become adversaries of Russia, whereas before they had been within Russia's sphere of influence, that's simply a geostrategic threat to Russia. And apparently, at some point after Putin came to power, by 2004, he's already well established in power. He decides that the red line will be Ukraine. And they've fought over it ever since, and that's where we are today. And people like Alexander Vinman, they're going to Monday morning quarterback all the time, even though largely they got so many things that they already wanted, they already got. They got all those weapons sent to Ukraine. They got the U.S. embroiled in the Ukrainian conflict. They got the European Union and NATO embroiled in it. And they were just trying to pick it apart over and over again. And they can't realize that this is something where they bit off a lot more than they could chew. That's about it. Please like, share, and subscribe. You can find me on all of these other platforms. If you want to follow me: Odyssey, Rumble, BitChute, YouTube, Podbean, Gab, Mind, Substack, Telegram, and Getter. And have a fantastic Friday, and let's hope for peace in our world. Amen.